Thanks, Kyle. So how was I gonna start? Okay. Um, so I am, just for those of you who don't know me, I do know a lot of people here, but I'm a hybrid of a social demographer and a developmental psychologist. And I study kids and young people in the United States and other countries. And I'm just gonna start off by saying this is the four ways that I do this. These are the four things I'm interested in. The first is about how the social ups and downs of high school, of which there are a lot, how that lays the foundation for long-term trajectories of educational attainment. The second is about how your family background creates disparities in learning through the educational system and how we can design interventions to reduce those disparities. The third is about how mothers raise children over many, many years and how it affects mothers, not just the children. And then the last is about the shape of the modern transition into adulthood, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So I am going to talk about my new book, The Journey into Adulthood in Uncertain Times with Shannon Kavanaugh. Spoiler alert or fun fact, she's also my spouse. And when we started this project, I think it's always good for young people to hear this. When we started this project, our two children were in pre-K and first grade. They are now sophomores and seniors in college. Research takes a long time sometimes, but here we are, and I'm just going to tell you like what we came up with and what we learned along the way. This is a book that targets the intersection of two social panics, modern social panic. The first one is about young adults in the United States and other affluent countries. This is the cover of the New York Times Magazine from about 20 years ago. You can see at the bottom it says, what is it about 20-somethings? The article actually starts with the question, why are young people in their 20s taking so long to grow up? And this is the panic about what we call adultolescence. So the idea that young people today are either unwilling or unable to join us in adulthood. And the idea is that they're stuck and we need them to get unstuck, for them, but also for us, because they need to take over things. And so we need them to do that. So the transition into adulthood is really about like when you're not a kid, but you're not yet an adult, which would be signified by full individuation for parents and the gradual acquisition of roles of social responsibility. Right? That's what it is. And whether your transition to adulthood is bumpy or smooth goes a long way to predicting lifelong outcomes. Now, over the last 50, basically over the course of my lifetime, this transitional period has gotten a lot longer and has become much more complex. So much so that there are people that argue that it's separating out and it's not a transitional period anymore. It's becoming its own stage of the life force. Just like when we invented adolescence about 140 years ago, right? Like the creation of adolescence happened where it went from a transitional period to its own stage of life force with all these values and norms associated with it. Maybe the same thing is happening with young adults. Now, back then and today, these new or potentially new stages of life course are very problematized. So there's a German phrase, I don't know if any of you have ever heard this, but there's a German phrase that was very frequently used to describe the core essence of adolescence back then at the turn of the century. And it was Sturm und Drang, which means literally storm and stress. So think about that. The core essence of adolescence is storm and stress. That is what people thought. Now, that is not necessarily true of young adulthood, right? It's like drifting and aimless. And so we need the German phrase for that, for anybody who studies German. So what's going on here? Well, this is really reflecting the convergence of several macro level trends, but I'm just going to focus on three. The first is the economic restructuring over the course of the last 5 decades or so that has really reshaped the labor market into an hourglass. So they have this like broad layer of more professional, more well-paying, secure jobs at the top, even broader layer of insecure, often contingent jobs at the bottom, and really not much in between. And so in that hourglass, the way to push through the bottleneck is through higher education. So like the returns to higher education have gone way up. Secondly, this is probably familiar to you all, there's been a real transformation in our norms and values about parenting in this country. And it's really created this helicopter parenting model. But more importantly, one of the shifts has been towards this idea that the most active stage of parenting lasts until basically the day you die, right? Like you never exit out of that stage anymore. And then the third thing is like our age norms for when it is appropriate to start a family have just gotten pushed way, way back. And so all three of these things have come together. And that is why that the percentage of Americans who say that someone in their early 20s or mid 20s is an adult has dropped by 25 percentage points just since the start of this century, right? Like that's a pretty precipitous drop. So there are a lot of people who are like, this is great, right? Like all this change just means young people today have this period of freedom where they can explore and self-actualize. And so David Brooks wrote an article, a column in the New York Times that said the Odyssey years, like this is what about it, how great this is. Well, there's also people who are much more pessimistic about all this change. And they say, well, yes, there's some people who have the privilege of going on an Odyssey. But most people are really going to be stagnating, you know, in this foreclosed opportunity. So my friend and mentor is a developmental psychologist and very cantankerous. His name is Larry Steinberg. He wrote a letter to the editor about this and basically said this Odyssey years idea is hogwash. And that over time, the Odyssey stage may come to characterize the life course of the majority of young Americans, just as adolescence began as a middle class institution, but it hasn't happened yet. And so what this psychologist is trying to do is speak more sociologically and saying, you know, what is missing from the public discourse about young adulthood today is really the concept of inequality. And so there have been a lot of social and behavioral scientists who've studied these issues, and with like special credit, there was the interdisciplinary MacArthur Network on transitions to adulthood. There's also really vibrant within developmental psychology, this area called emerging adulthood, which I'm not really a part of, but like respect to what they're doing. Okay, so as for the second panic, this is an article from The Atlantic, and it says, are today's youth really a lost generation? And this article specifically is about the Great Recession. But it could be about any national or global crisis, because whenever one of those crises happens, there is a very consistent idea that young people in their late teens through the mid-20s, are going to be the most affected. They're going to suffer the most because they're too old to like wait it out. And they're too young to have the foundation that they need to endure. So they start off behind and then they struggle to make up. So the Great Recession, like between 9/11 and the COVID pandemic, there was really no public, like historical event that loomed larger in the public imagination than the Great Recession. And, you know, it was like technically in the late 2000s, but, you know, it had a very long tail, a felt tail. And, you know, in many ways, there was a period effect that you saw like population-wide increases in depression and suicide and domestic violence. Interestingly, car wrecks went down, but you know, that's a different story. And so, you know, it seemed to be hitting across the board. But just like I alluded to earlier, at the time, there was a belief that there would be a cohort effect and that young adults would have the hardest time. So most Americans said, when asked, who's gonna suffer the most? They would say young adults, right? And that was really borne out in the immediate statistics, like the spike in joblessness that happened during the Great Recession. It was much more pronounced for this age group, and it never went back down. Really, like it never recovered the way that it did for other age groups. And it's of course grounded in like decades of econometric evidence about the impact on lifelong earnings of graduating from college and even like mild recessions, right? Like that is a scar that keeps on going. So that led to quotes like this by the economist Richard Freeman that said, these people will be scarred and they will be called the lost generation. So like, I always think, God, what is it if people said like the core essence of your stage of life is storm or stress? How disheartening that would be. But imagine hearing that, like when you're 22 years old, you know, and going through the thing. You are going to be part of a scarred generation. And of course, we've had lots of research on the impact of the Great Recession on a population, on people and young people, and a lot to learn from that. So we have two things going on here. One is this long-term historical trend, which is the decades-long evolution of what the transition into adulthood entails. And then you have a shorter-term historical event, which is the Great Recession. And connecting those two things is the same generational reality, which is that like because of the globalization of the economy, Young people today, people in their early 20s, are taking a lot longer to achieve financial independence than their peers did, in decades past, including my generation. And that's especially worse within that time span, those little blips of time when something bad happens, right? Like it makes it actually worse. And so this is a story of inequality because how those connections happen really maps onto the way that the country is stratified by race and gender and social class. So if you say, well, should we be worried about young adults? The answer is another question, which is like, which young adults are you talking about? Like that determines how I'm going to answer that question. And Shannon and I argued that like digging into that connection can tell us a lot about this stage of the life course, but also can help us think about or troubleshoot the policies that do or do not exist to serve this population. So how did we dig into this? I know we have some UNC people in the room, which is where I was a postdoc, and Shannon and I are both from that Glenn Elder family tree at UNC Chapel Hill. And so of course we go into life course theory to try and answer these questions. And basically, we thought, well, life course theory is about the passage of people across different stages of the life course. So we needed to tailor those general principles to the passage of people across a single stage of the life course, like how they move through that period of life. And we call that tailoring the journey perspective. So the journey perspective has 4 points, which looks at the transition into adulthood as historically fluid, which means that its form and function is shaped by broader historical forces that are punctuated by like these shocks that happen or crises that happen at any one time. B, it's developmentally dynamic, which means that it's encompassing the pathways, the intertwined pathways, personal and interpersonal and social, that young people are taking through this stage of life. C, it is experientially lived, which means that it is felt in the moment, subjectively felt in the moment and in memory by individual people in ways that do not always align with what other people think of as the objective reality. And then D, it is contextually grounded, which means the pathways that young people are taking through this period of life and how they're making sense of them emerge out of the family and community context that have structured their lives since the day they were born. So at this point, you'd say, well, you've got a theory or a theoretical perspective on this stage of life course, but you have not told us what the stage of the life course actually is. And so like, what age range are we talking about? Well, that's easier said than done. If you ask different people what the age range for the transition into adulthood is, they will give you different answers. So in some ways, it becomes an arbitrary choice. So we arbitrarily are focusing on 18 to 26. And that just happens to be that definition used by the National Academy of Sciences in their report on young adulthood. But the real reason we're doing this is because of the data. So I'm just going to be very honest with that. So for that age range, how are we thinking about the transition into adulthood? And we wanted to focus on domains of adjustment and functioning that did a few things. That there's a broad consensus that this is where a lot of the action of this time of life is, that they strongly predict adult outcomes, that they're frequently targeted by policy intervention, and that they can be, they're general constructs that can be broken down into more concrete measures. So we're going to focus on 3 domains here. The first is socioeconomic attainment, which is about the economic productivity and security of society, and we're capturing it through school enrollment and employment. Family building, which is about the reproduction of the population in terms of partnership and parenthood, and socio-emotional functioning, which is about the health and longevity of the population, which we're going to look at alcohol use and depression, both of which are huge parts of this stage of life in a way that other health outcomes often aren't at this stage. So for these 3 domains, we asked a few questions, and here are the expected answers. That we thought that the pathways that people would take through this period of life would evolve across multiple decades with clear deflections or spikes around the Great Recession. That those pathways would be characterized by more flux and divergence from norms of the past, especially during the Great Recession. That young people would make sense of these pathways by projecting a sense of order where other people see disorder, and that the observed and perceived flux of their pathways, especially during the Great Recession, would be most pronounced for people who grew up amidst insecurity, instability, and volatility in their families and communities. To answer these questions, we use three sources of data. The first, for historical fluidity, we use cross-sectional population data to map out trends in these domains between the ages of 18 to 26 for about the last 5 decades. For developmental dynamics and contextualization, we turn to prospective panel data, longitudinal panel data, to map out the pathways in these 3 domains during this age range, and then connect them back to family and community context. And for the experiential component, we created a new sample, every state in the United States, about 200 something people, and we gave them qualitative surveys, right? And then analyzed that data as if we had done interviews. So before I get to like how we connected these data to those questions and answers, I just wanted to say the book is very long. There's a lot going on in there, and I don't have you all day. So I'm not going to talk about everything. What I'm going to do instead is just take you through the 4 elements of that perspective for family building, because that's what I kind of care about the most. And I do that cumulatively, where each new element I bring in subsumes the other ones before it. And then I'll give you some highlights of them. So family building, let's start with the historical fluidity. So we have the current population survey, the annual supplement on annual social economic supplement, I think is what it's called. And so this is a cross-sectional survey of American adults that's done every year. And we picked out all the people who were between 18 and 26 in every year from 1971 till 2023. And we did 2 things with those data. The first thing we did was we mapped out or estimated the age group differences in marriage and parenthood in every single calendar year. And then we mapped out the age graded changes in marriage and parenthood between 18 to 26 for cohorts that like emerge from the middle of each of these decades. And they both told us the same thing, which is that marriage and parenthood go up incrementally with age, with each age, in every single year. Like the pattern is the same every year. But marriage and parenthood, regardless of age or for all ages, have gone way down across calendar years. So the family formation goes up developmentally and down historically. Like, which is a very common pattern that historical time and developmental time go in opposite directions. And I will get back to that in a little bit. So these are just the cohort pattern for marriage over time. And I'll just highlight here that like in 1971, happened to be the year I was born, that the majority of people in their mid-20s in the United States were married. And now in 2023-ish, there is no age group, even the oldest age group, that even a quarter of people are married, which is a pretty big drop, right? That drop has been much more precipitous for Asian Americans, much steadier for Latino Americans, and then across age and across years, marriage and parenthood are a lot lower for men and for African Americans. For parenthood, these are the cohort trends for that. I'll just say that you can't really tell just the way that these graphs work, but what is driving a large part of the decline in parenthood in this age range is solely about teen fertility, right? Like teenagers just don't have babies the way that they used to. We're at like the lowest point in American history, I guess world history. And that's driving a lot of those things. And Latinos and women had the highest rates of teen fertility in the 70s. So they had the most to fall, and boy, did they fall on those things. So if you mapped it out by group, you would see it's much steeper for those groups. So, you know, this is really just an illustration of the delay in family formation at this stage of life. That's a result of changing socioeconomic standards and cultural norms about family formation. And it's just like pushing this outside of the transition to adulthood. This is also, I'll just say, this analysis is where we first started getting the idea that maybe the Great Recession was not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. So was in the moment. I lived it. It's just not in the grand scheme of things. So turning to developmental dynamics, we used the children of the NLSY 79. So these are all the kids that were born to the original women in the NLSY 79 in the like late 90s, or excuse me, the 80s and the 90s, early 2000s. And so we picked every kid that was born to one of these women that passed completely from 18 to 26 in any year between the early 90s and the mid 2010s. And there's a lot of reasons why it's tricky to use these data for historical analysis, and I'm not going to go into them there, but I'm happy to answer those questions because this is something that always comes up. So what we did is we did sequence analysis to try and identify the most common pathways that young people combine or not, parenthood and partnership between 18 to 26. And these are the three, what I would call the most precarious family building pathways, which I say precarious because they forecast more problems, so social and economic problems in the future. So it's basically like doing things young, right? And doing marriage and, partnership and parenthood, especially parenthood at a young age, and also decoupling the two things. So stable, people who have kids and never partner, people who partner and have kids, especially a lot of kids, like more than expected, at younger ages, meaning like 20, 21, 22 years old. And if you take out a case you can take out a case and say this basically captures the demographic profile of someone who follows this pattern, what you will see is a very clear and perhaps not surprising connection between growing up in a more marginalized or disadvantaged position and more precarious family building pathways during this stage of life. So these are the less precarious. These are the ones that are predicting, more socioeconomic attainment over time. And this is basically not doing family formation, or if you do it, it's mostly the partnership part. And you'll see that two of these three, it says few children. That's actually a little misleading. Basically, these people are not having kids, but every once in a while, one person randomly in this thing will have a kid. And if they do, it's one. So it really is not having partnering or not partnering and not having kids. Which I will just tell you, this is what I did during this stage of life, 18 to 26. And so when you look at those representative profiles, it's the same thing, a very strong link between more advantages growing up and less precarity as a young adult. So we said, well, what gets people to following these different pathways? And, white youth are underrepresented in any of the pathways that have children. And they just don't have as many children at this age. African-American youth are underrepresented in pathways of marriage, overrepresented ones with non-marital parenting, and young men cluster in that single and childless. Like they're the real people in that single and childless category. Now, to bring in the historical fluidity, what we decided to do is we measured like a whole series of variables that basically captured when your transition to adulthood happened vis-a-vis the Great Recession, like before, during, after, and how long before and how long after. And we found that, that at the Great Recession, that people who transitioned into adulthood before the Great Recession, they were much less likely to be involved in any pathway that involved cohabitation. But upon closer look, that had nothing to do with the Great Recession. It's just the secular rise in cohabitation during this stage over time. And it just happened to look like it was anchored around the Great Recession, but it really was not. Okay, so I'm now going to go to the experiential component of this. And so, with MTurk, we created this sample and we interviewed all these people. And we gave them a survey, an online survey, where they filled out a life history calendar for every quarter of every year between 18 to 26. And then they filled out, or like they answered all these open-ended questions that were about the transition, their experiences during the transition to adulthood, whenever it happened, because they're the same age as the people and the children of the NLSY. And then they talked about their experiences during the Great Recession, also whenever it happened. They could have been young adults then or could have not. And we went through that. And there was something I was going to say about that, but now I can't remember, but I'll get back to it. And what we found is not much, that young people do not talk about family formation when you ask them about the transition to adulthood or the Great Recession. It's just not resonant for them, right? So, I mean, they just didn't say anything about this. And so sometimes they would talk about it kind of tangentially, and it was usually about their partner. So, like, this is just about the Great Recession, but it says, my boyfriend was terrified. You know, he was afraid he was going to be laid off, so he imposed all this cheapness on me. Or my spouse lost their job, so we fought all the time. And, you know, that kind of stuff. But, like, nobody ever said that they made a decision about family because of the Great Recession. Like they just did not say that. We didn't ask them, but they didn't say it. Some people would say, well, I know someone who did. And so it would be like, oh, well, I had friends who didn't have kids because they were afraid they were going to lose their job. It was never them. And importantly, every single person who said anything remotely like this was already in their late 20s or early 30s when the Great Recession happened. So like, it's just not picking up that much there. And so here's the funny thing. We have their life history calendar data. We know that they're partnering and having kids. But when you ask them about this period of life, they don't mention that. And you could say, well, did you ask them that? No, we didn't ask that. We also didn't ask them about work, school, drinking, depression, and they talked about all that stuff a lot. This is the one thing that they did not talk about, even though they were doing it. And this is just a classic example of the lack of data being data. You know, it says something about the way we think about this period of life. So with the contextual part, we went back to try and predict those sequences in the LSY. And, you know, we were trying to like, you know, come up with a way of thinking about security, which is more about the resources that are available to you, and instability, which is more about people around you. And we wanted to compare where you were in the transition to adulthood versus where you grew up, or like how you grew up. And what we found is that like family history mattered a lot more than the community context, but family history mattered very different ways. So the first way is that family insecurity, which is about poverty, it's really about your exposure, your cumulative exposure to poverty since birth. That's what differentiates these pathways. With family structure, it was not your family structure history, it was where you kind of launched into adulthood from, which is kind of interesting because, you know, I and Shannon both have done a lot of work basically arguing that family structure at any one time has no meaning at all. It's all about the history of it, and we appear to be wrong, but I don't think we were. And I have reasons why I could say that if anyone is interested. I will also say that all of the causal inference checks that we did, especially around unobserved confounds, that the family structure part of this is slightly more suspect than the family poverty thing, which is not going to surprise a lot of you, I'm sure. So to bring in the Great Recession and historical timing, we looked basically at how this would vary across different periods related to the Great Recession. And we did find something there. It's kind of interesting that basically your family context, whether it's poverty or family structure, really starts mattering at the Great Recession, but it's in this really weird way, which is that it doesn't differentiate the more or less precarious pathways. It only differentiates among the less precarious pathways. So like at a certain level of comfort or stability, basically, that's when the family stuff starts to matter. But it's not really making a difference in like one end or the other. And then bringing back in the qualitative data around these questions about family and community. So young people, when you ask them to talk about the transition to adulthood or the Great Recession, they do not talk about families of formation. But man, they talk a lot about families of origin. Like that is how they are filtering their experiences. So we really saw, so I'm just going to focus on the part that's about the Great Recession here, that they saw their families as the nexus of the economic crisis. So this goes all the way back to the children of the Great Depression and what developmental psychologists call the family process model, which is this. Something happens, like some crisis happens, it affects your parents. And that, by affecting their parents, it affects family dynamics, especially parenting and household dynamics. And then that is what affects kids. And we see this a lot here. This is the most common thing people said about the Great Recession. It's about their parents. So stepfather lost his mortgage. It caused turmoil that broke apart my family, that rifts still exist to this day. Affects the parents, trickles down to the kid. Or this person said, my dad was let go of his job and the quality of my home life declined. I would see my parents arguing with each other because they were stressed over all of their losses. This is the classic example of the family process model, right? So we also saw what I call a lot of path dependence, which means if you were already in trouble, like it was worse to go through the Great Recession. So this one person says, my future is not bright, my options are limited. I picked the shortest and safest route to stability and steady income, meaning that he had to make decisions in the short term, could not afford to think about the long term, which is a very common way. It's called income effect, about recessions and economic crisis. And then on the other side, the kids who grew up in like more like privileged backgrounds, it was as if the Great Recession never happened. They'd be like, what are you talking about? They had no idea. It was no big deal. They just did not feel affected by it. But we saw one exception to this path dependence, which is the most economically disadvantaged, who had grown up in the most disadvantaged circumstances, actually also did not feel like the Great Recession mattered to them at all. And the reason is because they didn't have anything to lose. And so they just were like, yeah, well, it didn't really change. So this one person says, I don't think my family was affected. We didn't own property or have money in the stock market. Like what was there to lose, right? To do that. So you see the traces of the intergenerational transmission of inequality. It's just there's some complications. So now I'm just going to give you some highlights of these other things about socioeconomic attainment. So, when you look at these, the most common pathways of socioeconomic attainment at that time, you see like these like low education and more unemployment, or employment instability. There's two of those pathways. Then there's two pathways that are all about like more time in the higher education and a delayed entry into the labor force. And then there's the like bridging pathway, which is like you don't stay a lot in education, but you somehow manage to secure a place in the labor force that keeps going. And demographically speaking, the interesting part about this is especially Latino men are really what's driving that bridging category. Like that's where they are clustering the most. When it comes to the Great Recession, there's one very consistent impact, and it has to do with what we call the college to work pathway. And this is, you might think of as like the new traditional path, which is you finish high school in your late teens, you go directly into higher education. You stay in higher education for 4 or 5 years, you leave in your early 20s, and you don't go back. That's that pathway. During the Great Recession, people got knocked out of that pathway, but they either went in actually almost exactly equal numbers down into the lower education and more unemployment pathway, or up into the delayed entry into the labor force and more higher education pathway. And those were the people who were actually going to graduate school. There was a lot of them in there. A lot of you probably. And then lastly, about family insecurity and family instability. Again, they both matter, but they never overlap in how they matter. Family insecurity, which is poverty, is all about differentiating people on employment. And family instability, which is family structure, is all about differentiating people on education. So there's no overlap in how they matter to that. I would say, like, going to the experience of this thing, the number one thing people talk about when you ask them about the transition to adulthood or the Great Recession is socioeconomic attainment. It's work and school. I mean, I would say if I had to like map out like the actual data points on these things, it would be like 10 to 15 to 1. Like how much more they talk about this than anything else. And which, is not surprising, not just because it's an economic crisis, or it's just much more likely for people to view this period of life solely through the lens of economic like attainment now than they used to do. So I'm just to boil this down, I'm gonna focus on education during the Great Recession. And you see these two frames, which is the people, and it's by cohort, the people who entered the transition to adulthood when the Great Recession happened, use this failure to launch frame, which is all about like how how the Great Recession disrupted their plans. And so, someone would say, well, I never wanted to get in construction like my father. School was always the path I wanted to take. Never took it. I never got back onto it. So he didn't go to school like he had planned. Then there are people who went to school like they planned and dropped out, which they did not plan on doing, right? So you have someone who says the worth of a college degree dropped significantly. It all felt so insignificant. I became so focused on just finding work and surviving that I lost sight of college, and I've yet to return. Then there were people who did go to college as planned, but they didn't do it in the way that they planned. And there's two common examples of that. One are the people who didn't go to the school they wanted to go to because of the Great Recession. So she said, I had to go to a cheaper school because there was no security and no guaranteed path. And then there were the people who chose a different major. And so this, I think, is like where the sociologist and, like lost traction during this period, right? Because people moved out of those types of majors over time. The people who were older, like in their mid to late 20s, or excuse me, mid 20s, when the Great Recession happened, they use what I call stalled momentum. And it's all about how the Great Recession either kept them from realizing the returns to their investment in higher education, or it kept them from going back to school. Let's say it changed their plans about going back to school. So, there's like this warehousing effect that happens in recessions where, especially for more privileged people, where they wait out recessions by going to school. And so they had this one guy who said, I was planning to go back to school for a business degree, but it was getting so competitive because people in finance lost their jobs and decided to go back to school. So this is the guy who had, he was a planful dude. He was like, I'm going to do this. And then after this many number of years, I'm going to go back and get an MBA. But when that year that he decided to do that, he got screwed because everybody decided to go back and MBA. And he actually didn't get accepted to any of the MBA programs. And he probably would have before that. And then there was a woman who did go back to school as a way of earning more money in her, it was like more of an arts field, and she thought this would help her. And she said, it ultimately didn't help me much, as work is my field is hard to find. So basically what happened is she went to school, and just by an accident of timing, she graduated at the worst possible time. So she didn't get anything out of it. And I would say that the people who are most frustrated, who express the most frustration with school and work followed the exact same patterns, there was one clear differentiating thing, which was downward mobility. So it was not being economically stressed as a young adult or growing up in economic disadvantage. It was starting out with security and going down the ladder. That is like if we did a quantitative analysis of the qualitative data, that would be the significant predictor is downward mobility, more than race, more than gender, more than anything else. Okay, so for socio-emotional functioning, this is a growth curve of drinking from 18 to 26. And you probably know that drinking tends to increase between the ages of 18 to 26. And the biggest single culprit is where you all are standing right now, like it's college campuses. But you might not have known that drinking for all people in this age range has gone way, way down historically. So yes, 26-year-olds drink more than 18-year-olds, but all 18 to 26-year-olds today drink a lot less than 18 to 26 years old, especially in the 80s and 90s. So actually, if you map this all out, the worst drinking for teenagers and young adults is my cohort. So I graduated from high school in 1990, that's the worst. And going to college in the early 90s, it's been all downhill since then. So this is the growth curve, or uphill maybe, growth curve for depression. So depression goes down. A lot of people don't know that. 18 to 26 is like a stabilizing period in the life course. And mental health generally gets better during this time after you've moved out of adolescence. But you probably know that among 18 to 26-year-olds, depression has gone way, way up over the last couple of decades. And you've probably, if you're following that, you've heard the debate about what is causing that, right? Which is what? It tends to coincide with the rise of something. social media and phones and smartphones. I will just say I could come back next year and give a whole lecture about this. Social media might be important in certain instances. It does not explain that historical trend. Something else. You got to find something else to talk about. It's not just that. The one thing I was also going to say about this is like, this is where we saw the clearest Great Recession effect. Like of all the things we saw, the clearest one is that upward slope of drinking, that developmental upward increase in drinking during this time of life got really softened during the Great Recession. So it didn't go up as much as you would expect. And that, when you couple that with a very consistent evidence that measures of economic disadvantage, poverty in the community and the family actually predict less drinking during this time, you put those two things together, it just reminds you that during this period of life, drinking is not so much about self-medication of strain the way that it is among adults. It is about opportunities for social engagement. And anything that interferes with that is going to reduce drinking, which isn't necessarily a good thing. Like, so then you think, well, okay, wait, do we want them to drink more? Like, kind of, but not because we want them to drink, but because it's a proxy for them to be more socially integrated. So people sometimes don't like it when I say that, but I'm going to keep saying it. So here's the thing, like, there's two poles the way that people thought about being a young adult during the Great Recession, completely opposite, about 50-50. There were the optimists who were like, it's all about resilience and turning points and life lessons. They saw the silver lining. They had this grit narrative. So I said, it was a big struggle, but these things teach you and strengthen you. I was definitely affected by the recession, and it was definitely for the better. These people were like, I am a better person because I went through this, which I really admire. Not so sure it's true, but like our perceptions matter, like as they drive our behavior. And then there were the other people who were just overwhelmingly cynical about other people and especially about social institutions. So it basically lets me know that no one will help anyone other than the rich. You have to save as much as possible because the system will collapse. Very common statement. An even more common statement is, it showed me that the greatest country in the world is run by the same corrupt people you find anywhere else, and they will sell you and your family down the river. Again, there was a slight, there's two things that predict someone falling into this camp. The first one is downward mobility, for sure. Again, not status, mobility or downward mobility. The second is the interaction between that and gender. So it is men, especially white men, who have gone down the ladder. That's who talks like this. And let me share, that helps me understand the last 10 years in this country a lot more, right? Like just seeing this happen in real time. So I'll just close by saying, in this book, one of the things we do at the end is we take all these elements of the journey perspective, and then we summarize the results. We try and distill some abstract lessons from them. And then we try and say, well, this is how it might be policy relevant. And then that whole last chapter is just structured around this, like going through the 4x3 table and going through each cell. And I'm not going to end with that. Instead, I'm going to just end like at the very beginning. The editors of this series said, you have so much going on in here, you need to tell people at the very beginning what they're going to find out, which I know is what economists do, at the start of their papers. So we finally did that. So I'm actually going to share with you what happens at the very beginning. If you read this book, you only have to go like 5 pages in, and you will see what I'm about to tell you, which is these are the big takeaway lessons. That history is evolutionary, right? And anything that happens is swamped by that evolution. The population is very diverse. And so you see all this, incredible heterogeneity in people, what you do. But when you actually look down into it, people follow some very basic types, right? It isn't quite as crazy as it's made out to be. Development and history often go in opposite directions, as does family structure and family poverty. Young adults elevate socioeconomic attainment above everything else. Like that's how they define this stage of life. And the psychic toll of hard experience is processed through positive and negative framings that are not always tied to the socioeconomic reality. And this is just the people cope in different ways. Some people are more negative in the way that they cope, but it's still coping, right? Some people are more positive, but it's still coping. The motivation is the same, even though it looks very different, and the eventual outcomes of that are going to be very different. So I'll just close by saying that, I think that this is less like, yes, young adulthood has gotten longer and it's gotten more complex. But I think that's more of a reflection on us, meaning adults, than it is on them. And that we need to look at that reflection and think about the world that we have handed over to them. And there is no evidence that young people today do not want to grow up. There's just none. It just doesn't exist. So, and maybe when they do delay these adult things, it's because it makes sense the way that the world works right now. And so, of course, they're going to have these ups and downs if they're playing by the rules that we created or that someone else created for us, even though the game is completely different, right? Like it's a mismatch between those two things. So I'm going to leave you with the last line of the book, which is this. Perhaps then we should lay off young adults for a moment to reflect less on what they are doing and more on what we have done to them. And I'm going to now remind you that the authors of these books have 2 young adult children. And we are trying to remember this, but it's sometimes not easy to do. So thank you. Yeah.
Research methods process question.
Okay.
About using MTurk. Sort of why did you decide to use it for the purpose of these qualitative data and over there versus more conventional?
Yeah, so I wanted to make sure, the reason that we did that was because I wanted to make sure that we had people from across the country. And so every project I ever does has a qualitative component, and that's usually ethnographic or interview based. We started this before the pandemic. And now I've learned that you are not geographically bound in your qualitative data collection the way I thought then. So that was one reason. The second thing is that was just at the time, a lot of the people who were doing field experiments this is what they were using. So we just picked it. I've now abandoned MTurk. I don't use it anymore. And I also thought it was good because you could put filters in so that so like, this is not a representative sample, but it's actually not bad because we filled cells over time to do it. So that was the number one reason to do it. Now I've switched. And so I do qualitative data collection in the same way I do, even though I tend to do it virtually. But I care less about the geographic radius of that. But when I did do this for my most recent grant, they did encourage me to have like a multi-state sample for it. And I switched to something called Prolific. Have you ever used that? And the reason is because MTurk has been ruined by bots. So we did make them talk to us to make sure they were real people. So yeah. Just a quick reminder to question. Okay, sorry. She asked me about MTurk. I don't think I would use it again. It was a special circumstance. Yeah. 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 So for every single one of these pieces, we did have you asked me about policy, the policy implications. I didn't talk about here just because I don't have enough time and I took up too much time anyway, but that is the final chapter of the book. But we did it in a couple of ways. One thing, we tried to look at the policies that were out there that were specifically targeting young adults and try and think about what we're finding say about whether they do or do not work. The other thing is we tried to do is when there's policy discussions about things that could be done, we'd say, well, this is the path that would be most likely. And some of them are not necessarily specific to young adults, right? They're about coordinated services and, dealing with this gap. If we think that all 25-year-olds are children, but they're legally adults, like how to deal with that gap between those two things. And then the last thing is we tried to think about, like, for example, the qualitative research, how we can use qualitative research more effectively in policy discussions about things like that. So, and then the other thing, just because I come from the education field, we spend a lot of time going through education and training programs that seem to have evidence that they work or not, and how that relates to what we find. So I promise it's in there, but it's funny. I'll just say, like, this is the like conundrum that you have, is that when we first wrote it this way, one of the reviewers, I'll just share it with you because you're like, this is career development. Like, one of the reviews for this is the worst review I've ever gotten for anything in my life, and it was insulting. Like, and they used my name, and they call me Rob, not Robert. So just take that as you. I think I know who it is. But one of the criticisms was about policy, and they said, because all along the editors and the initial internal reviews were like, you have to connect this to policy. But the review is like, you have observational data and qualitative data. You cannot speak about any policy here, you know, and that's the conundrum that we get.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about the downward mobility part of the story. I don't know if you remember, but Captain Newman has a book from the 80s.
Yeah.
Probably great. And I just think in sociology we tend to spend instead of that quality, poverty and love. And so, yeah, if you want to speak more to the downward mobility, after that part.
Okay, so the questions about the downward mobility part, and I did talk to Catherine actually about this when this was happening. So I actually, it's interesting. I am always been more focused on downward mobility because I think maybe it's because it gets at my absolute worst fear in life is like falling down, downward. And so I kind of was primed to be, I was overwhelmed by how consistent it was. But I will say there's a flip side to this, which is that those people who are like silver linings, those are the upwardly mobile people. So it is both sides of the coin. Like it really socializes them into a different way of thinking. And we did like go back quantitatively and check this to look at people at NLSY who, you know, appeared to be downwardly mobile, and it is there in the quantitative data too. And I think this is just a perfect example about like, you know, in grad school at Stanford, I was actually trained as a social psychologist. And I've never left behind my like the power of social psychological mechanisms and how divorced from, this sounds judgmental, but I don't mean it that way, but it's like how divorced from reality we often are and how irrational we are about the way that we think. And I think that downward mobility is one of those things that those people who are downwardly mobile often were doing better than the people who were straight up disadvantaged, but they looked at things completely different. And I think that that's always an important lesson when you're using population data to remember that, you know, it's really hard to think about the way people think about that. And that's why interviewing people is really good. I was talking to someone today. I was like, you should go interview people, even if it's 5 people, just to hear what they have to say about it. Yes.
But does the change in the drinking age by law affect, you kind of draw like a reference continuity type thing in 1984?
Yeah, so it's nice because, you know, they still adopted it in a more staggered way over time. Drinking laws. My brother was in that horrible position where the law changed. He was illegal for a year and then illegal for, and they didn't grandfather them in or grandmother them in. So like, that's great. But I did not do that, but there has been evidence that this is one case, a policy really had a huge effect. And so what it did is it has dampened drinking. I would say a lot of it is, you know, more cultural, but like there was definitely a policy impact. It had a lagged effect. It took a while. But what it did is it seemed to shift drinking to this like early 20s so that drinking among teenagers dropped, but the drop among older people, like immediately, it actually increased among people in their 20s. So it did seem like people were kind of like, there's like pent up demand, I guess. I don't know. Like they then got past that age and there was more drinking. And so the imbalance between 20 something drinking and teenagers drinking is actually pretty much starker now than it used to be. And that has to be some sort of like policy effect, but also all the cultural things. Like we just redefined drinking, I think. Like, and we redefined, more importantly, we redefined college. Right, as drink, because it's just the college students. Yeah.
There's a question online that's related to
Yeah.
this. Do you have any in the 1956 age group following
Yes, all substance abuse, except for, the new ones. Vaping, no. But yes, all monitoring the future out of the University of Michigan, late great John Schulenberg, like that is how we know all of this stuff. And they've APC'd the hell out of those, those trends. And it's kind of interesting actually with drug use. One of my favorite things about it is that every generation picks like a new drug, right? Like, so there's cohort effects along the way. So like people, like when I was growing up, like there was a big burst in cocaine use and then it kind of went down. And so I actually think it's a rejection of what your parents were doing. Seriously, I think that you're like, well, I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to pick a new one. And then the next generation, like, I'm not going to do that and do that. So that's a really interesting thing. And it's important because all trends among teenagers and young adults for like behavior and all that stuff are like in a positive direction. Except for depression and anxiety, like mental health is going the opposite way. And there are people who use all those positive trends to say, God, we've really worried about young people. They're doing too well. The reason is, and I actually believe some truth in this, is that they're not, it's this not growing up thing. Wait, teenagers are supposed to be doing a bad thing. Why are they spending so much time with their parents? That is not developmentally healthy, right? And has good benefits in the moment. That's the argument. I'm not endorsing that argument, but that's the argument. Yeah.
So can you speculate on the mental health? You said it's not, you implied that you don't think it's social media, which.
Yeah, I do think it's social media.
Oh, you do think it's.
But I think like Candace Odgers, who's my favorite researcher in this area, she's down at UC Irvine. She basically shows that social media has an impact on people who are vulnerable, right? So kids who are already vulnerable to mental health issues struggle with social media, but most kids are not super affected in terms of mental health by it. So there is an effect there. That is not enough. And she says, like, she estimates it's about like social media could account for at most about 10% of the increase. So what is it? So then like I've been interviewed on NPR once and someone kind of yelled at me a little bit. They're like, well, if it's not social media, what can it be? And I said, have you seen? I'm gesturing to the people online. I'm gesturing at the world around us and the insecurity. It's the exact same thing that is driving helicopter parenting. The fears and the insecurity. And of course, the helicopter parenting might be driving this too, the mental health problem. So I think it's more just the sense of not aimlessness, but like insecurity. That to me is probably a more likely, but of course it's hard to quantify like what those things are. And I'll also say about that, like just the fears and all of that stuff going on, that one of the women that, is a big proponent of the social media effect, who's a psychologist, she's actually done research. It's in like the Atlantic, I think you can read this, that showing like where young adult, like millennials are economically speaking in terms of home ownership and money. And she's like, it's not that bad. Like they're actually doing fairly similar in many indicators to previous generations, in some ways better. And she's like, but when you interview all these people, they're like, no generation has ever worse. I'm not discounting what's going on, but at the same time, it's another example, like our perceptions are like they're a real driving force. And in some ways, I think the way we talk about millennials is actually fueling their fears and concerns. So. Oh wait, I'll talk to you afterward. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah, they do. Well, that's my colleague David Yeager, who his like kind of big thing is about how policies targeting young people. What we know as developmentalists, what the developmental tasks and processes of adolescents are, is that the thing is an obsession with status and respect. That's partly biological. It's partly socialization. So why don't the interventions for like eating better or not drinking, why don't they incorporate what we know? You can't tell a teenager, don't do this because this will happen to you and don't be dumb to do that. That is not respectful. But if you turn it around and say, you're smart enough to understand. It's like, here's what's going on, and here's how like all that kind of stuff. It really works. Smoking campaign. It worked. They were like, don't smoke because it'll give you cancer. It was don't smoke because the man is trying to keep you down. Man, did that work? What? Yeah. So, okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.